Hello, y'all. Here we are back for Historical Period 6. As usual, I would strongly recommend that you have your course and exam descriptions out as we work through this historical period. This is a big one. This is basically the Gilded Age historical period, and it is a very common feature on the AP exam. The College Board loves the Gilded Age. And so as you see, as we sort of work through this, there's a lot of stuff that sort of kind of comes in this unit that actually starts in the historical period before or continues in the historical period after. The two sort of start and end dates here. Number one, we're starting with 1865, the end of the Civil War, which is a big kind of spur or cause of the Gilded Age. So the first part of this unit overlaps Reconstruction, which was in the last historical period. And then it ends in 1898. That is the year of the Spanish-American War. It's sort of like the beginning of the imperialism era of the United States. You'll notice when we get to historical period 7 that there's, again, some overlap there as that historical period starts in 1890. So again, this is fair game for all of the sections of the exam, and here we go. First kind of topic in historical period 6 deals with what's often called the closing of the frontier, or sort of the settlement of the West. Basically where we're at this point is that the United States has sort of settled most of the kind of available territory in our section of North America, and we are kind of closing in on the last remaining area that is unsettled by Americans and still occupied by Native American tribes who are living sort of like relatively traditional lifestyles. You'll notice the key concepts, there's sort of two here, 6.2 and 6.3, are divided basically into asking you to look for the economic causes and effects of settlement and then the social and cultural causes and effects. So cause and effect in both cases, but just kind of divided between economic and social and cultural. So we're also going to be looking at causes and effects. First up, causes. Why is there westward settlement in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s? There's two really big kind of key pieces of specific information that I would encourage you to talk about as causes here. One is the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862. The passage of the Homestead Act happens during the Civil War by the Republican-controlled Congress. That's a law that possibly wouldn't have gotten passed without the Civil War. So we talked about that in class. And what the Homestead Act said was that the federal government will give for free to any like head of household in the United States who wants it 160 acres of free land out in the Great Plains somewhere, right out in the unsettled parts of the United States. But you have to, number one, live on it. So you can't like stay at your home and then just own this land as like a side project. And number two, you have to do what the government calls improve it, by which they mean farm it, plant trees, right? Sort of tame the land and make it kind of like productive is the basic idea here. This is going to encourage floods of Americans. I mean, free land, right? Like this is going to encourage a lot of people to move out to the Great Plains. But as we'll see once they get there, it's very difficult to sort of sustain like a living farming on the Great Plains. You had 3 to 5 years to sort of make the land successful, and a lot of people do not hit that mark. So that's a Homestead Act, one of the things that brings one of the causes of westward settlement. Another really big one is kind of the railroads broadly, with the Transcontinental Railroad as like a specific symbol or signpost of this. The Transcontinental Railroad, of course, is the railroad that connects the United States all the way from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast at its terminus at San Francisco. We already had most of the East Coast built up out to about the Mississippi River or thereabouts. So the Transcontinental Railroad is mostly spanning across the Great Plains and the various deserts and the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevadas. It has a lot of very rugged terrain to kind of cross. It's quite a big construction project, and very significantly, it is subsidized by the federal government. This is the first time that we've really seen the federal government do this. When we say that they're subsidizing the business, what they're doing is they're paying for part of it, and in the case of the Transcontinental Railroad, what they're doing is like giving the land to the railroad companies for free. So this is federal government-owned land. You get it for free, and in exchange, a railroad is built. It's your business, right? You get to make money off of it. But you got some help from the federal government because we want to support the construction of this railroad. It's good for the United States. They also do that with the building of telegraphs, the Transcontinental Telegraph as well. And once the railroad sort of fully connects the United States, it makes travel into this area of the West much easier. I think the sort of common statistic is that it took about 6 months to cross this whole area on like the wagon train, like on Oregon Trail. And then as soon as the Transcontinental Railroad spike is connected and the like railroad is intact, it goes down to about 6 days. So it's like a really significant drop in the travel time, and that's bringing people out, but also bringing like supplies, lumber, all sorts of things. So the Homestead Act and the Transcontinental Railroad are like high value vocab terms for this particular unit. It has been a very long time. I would say it's been like at least 5 or 6 years since I've looked at a set of released questions, like all of the SAQs, LEQs, and DBQs for any given exam year, and not seen one that you could use the Transcontinental Railroad as evidence for. Like this just, it crosses over so many different topics. And like I said, it's a highly tested area of the test. A thing that the College Board will often kind of like check in about or want you to sort of know or think a little bit about is the question of whether sort of like once people moved out into the West, like how different was society out there? Is it, people are coming West because they're sort of like rugged individuals like doing it for themselves, which was kind of the narrative at the time period, right? Individual pioneers striking out across the wilderness. There absolutely was some of that going on. But I think it's also useful to understand that a lot of the people who were coming West were doing very similar type of jobs in very similar socioeconomic situations to the people working in factories in the East in this time period as the Gilded Age is going on. So if you're working for the railroad or if you're working for like a mining company, you're a wage laborer, right? Just like somebody who's working for, Andrew Carnegie, back in Pittsburgh. So just a good thing to remember, side thing to remember. Effects. So effects of westward settlement, obviously one of the effects is that like settlement moves westward, right? The population is shifting west. You can see these two graphs of maps of population density here with the darker brown colors indicating a more dense population, more people living there. And you can see that even as it gets denser, there's still a lot of open area because this is still quite difficult geographic terrain. The West in this time period has the reputation of being the most diverse area of the country, and that's true in terms of like racial population, ethnic population, in some ways socioeconomic population. Jobs like cowboy were quite mixed racially. You have black cowboys, you have Native American cowboys, you have cowboys who are Mexican or like Mexican American, your white cowboys, of course, all sorts of different people kind of working together because the social structure is less like policed in the West, right? You're a little bit further from like quote unquote civilization. Other impacts of westward movement. The College Board very much wants you to know about farmers in this time period. They're a fairly big part of historical period 6. So when we talk about farmers in this time period, there are farmers in the South, right? We talked about tenant farming and sharecropping in the last unit, but the sort of population that is traditionally referred to as quote unquote farmers by the College Board in this time period are these new homestead farmers who've taken their 160 acres of land and now they're living in, like Nebraska or North Dakota or Oklahoma or somewhere like that. And once they get out there, a lot of them find out that it's very difficult. Even experienced farmers who had a long time family farm in North Carolina and then moved to Oklahoma are going to find things difficult. The Great Plains has extreme weather, they have tornadoes, they have hailstorms, lots of snow, they get plagues of locusts, right, in this time period coming out of the Rocky Mountains. There's extreme drought often, so like not very much rainfall. Today we are, I think, much more aware that most of the land that these people are trying to homestead is not actually like sustainable farmland, right? It's not land that really regularly gets enough rain for you to be able to grow like corn on it every year, let's say, or wheat, and then make a profit every single year. But the homesteaders in this time period are they're in the finding out stage of that particular realization. Other problems of farmers, a big one is the increase in mechanization, which on the surface I don't think seems like a problem because mechanization, of course, makes farming easier in many ways. We're seeing farming kind of industrialize in this time period in some ways. Up above me up here, this is what's called a prairie fan. It's an irrigation tool to draw water out of the aquifers. This down here is the steam plow, which is introduced in this time period. It's just a plow that runs on steam, right? So innovations like those are being introduced in this time period, which is great. Like, okay, I can farm more. I can bring in more crop, I can make more money, but at the same time, these cost. And you have to have money to buy a steel plow, and if you don't have money, then maybe you're going to get a mortgage on your farm that you got for free from the United States government. Or you might go into debt, right, to buy some of these tools to kind of keep up. So increasingly, by the time we get to 1900, farming is becoming something that's like increasingly industrialized, and it's getting harder and harder and harder for just kind of like your average like small family farm to kind of like compete on the marketplace. So that's the kind of mechanization stuff. As I mentioned, most American farms in this time period are going to wind up mortgaged, even though so you got your farm for free from the government and now you have mortgaged it as a source of cash, right, or to try to keep the farm going. And banks in this time period tended to charge farmers very, very high rates of interest. So you could, buy one steam plow and then your grandchildren are still paying it off, like 30 years later. And so what all of this adds up to, everything on this slide, if you had to sum up like what are the problems of the farmers in the Gilded Age, the single word answer is debt. right? Farmers are in a lot of debt, and that is an important thing to understand because it has a lot to do with some of the political movements that spring up out of the farmers in this time period. Speaking of which, the College Board sort of splits around, or kind of, I guess, sort of divides up where it talks about or where it includes what they often call the farmer kind of cooperative organizations like the Grange and the Farmers Alliance and the Populist Party, which we're going to talk about here. I'm putting them here with sort of like effects of westward settlement where I think they belong, but I did also kind of paste in over on the side there 611 and then 613 where they like come up again. They come up as a reform movement, which they certainly are, in response to like capitalism. So industrial capitalism is happening and I'm on the losing side, and sort of what am I going to do about it? These are one answer from the farmer perspective. And it also comes up in a later key concept that's asking about comparing and contrasting political parties of the Gilded Age, because the last one of these, the Populist Party, is a political party. So we're going to talk just a little bit about each of these very briefly here, but keep in mind that they're like relevant for some of the later key concepts as well. So farmer cooperative organizations start out in like the 1860s and 1870s as just kind of like, okay, we're all sort of getting together and we're, talking about farming stuff. Maybe, we're kind of pooling our money collectively to like, buy a steam plow together or something like that. The first one that really emerges with like a political bent to it is called the Grange, or the Patrons of Husbandry, I think is like the fancy name, but the Grange is what it's known by. Pops up mostly in the 1870s, places like Illinois, and then out into kind of like the Midwest and the Great Plains. The Granges, like the thing that the Grange is particularly known for is that local state level Granges are going to wind up lobbying individual states to pass what are called Granger laws. And what these Granger laws are almost always focused on was trying to limit charging that railroad could do. So limit like railroad pricing and try to limit what farmers, I think correctly, thought was railroad price gouging. These laws are like successful and then unsuccessful. So they're passed in a series of states where they basically say, like in the state of whatever, Illinois, railroads can't charge more than like $1 per ton for freight. I just made up all those numbers. And so the state of Illinois would pass that, and then all of the railroads that go through Illinois, in theory, have to obey this law. But many of the railroads were like, well, wait a minute, like, this is a state law, but we're going through like a whole bunch of states. Isn't that supposed to be a federal government thing? So eventually in the 1880s, the Supreme Court rules in a court case called Wabash versus Illinois that the Granger laws are unconstitutional. Only the federal government can like regulate interstate commerce, and this leads to the federal government starting to regulate interstate commerce. One of the very first regulatory agencies ever created in the United States is the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is still around today. And what the ICC does is it regulates railroads, right? So the Grange produces some like effective reform there. Next down from the Grange is the Farmers Alliance. The Grange is really like a lobbying organization, basically, in its political bent anyway. The Farmers Alliance is more sort of trending towards a political party. There's a whole bunch of regional alliances. They merge, like a whole thing. You can read more about it if you want to, but what you mostly need to know is that what the Farmers Alliances are going to start to run people for office. Mostly local offices like the mayor or on the town council, or state level offices like in the Nebraska State House or things of that nature, who are specifically representing farmers and farmer interests, and with sort of farmer-backed political positions. But some of the people inside of the Farmers Alliance get kind of ambitious, I think, or sort of more big-brained about the problems, and they're like, really, these problems that we have, they're not just problems of farmers, they're really problems of people kind of on the wrong side of capitalism, right? The lower class or the working class. And really, we have a lot in common with those working class people in the cities. And there's not enough like farmers for us to have a farmer president, but there's enough working class people for us to have like a working class president, right? If we could all sort of unite and vote together. And it's out of that idea that we get the Populist Party. So the Populist Party is very correctly associated with farmers. It comes out of these farmer movements. But the idea of the Populist Party was that it was going to be this broader, right, political organization that would include not just farmers, but other working class kind of like reformist groups as well. And we will come back and talk just a little bit more about some of the Populist Party elections later on in this set of notes when we are talking about the politics of the Gilded Age. So again, Grange, Farmers Alliance, Populist Party are all really good like specific pieces of information to talk about how farmers respond to the problems that they have during the Gilded Age. A good kind of point of comparison is that none of these are labor unions, but they're kind of similar to labor unions in that they are cooperative organizations formed by like workers, right? And in this case, in response to the problems of industrial capitalism. Okay. Another big effect of westward settlement, of course, has to do with what happens with the Native Americans who are already living in the Great Plains and the sort of surrounding areas. The United States has been fighting an ongoing series of wars that we kind of broadly refer to as the Indian Wars since there's been a United States, and then, before that in the colonial period. So in previous videos, we've talked about things like the Northwest Territory War, the War of 1812 with the Tecumseh League as part of it, and a variety of others as well. This is sort of the last phase of the Indian Wars here. It starts basically around like during the Civil War and then is going to sort of escalate. Its height is in the 1870s, with the most famous battle being the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, right around the same time that Reconstruction is ending. This is the last phase of sort of American settlement, and so traditionally, the U.S. government's policy for Native Americans has been to sort of push them west, right? Push them onto unwanted sort of western land. You go west, you go to Oklahoma. We don't want that land anyway. Get west of the Mississippi River. And we've just kind of run out of west at this point, right? Now we want all of the land, and we want Oklahoma to be homesteaded and not, Indian territory. So what happens in the 1860s and 1870s is the U.S. federal government's policies shift. And instead of being like, westward, 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 we see some new themes emerge. We see a real commitment to the idea of reservations, which is the idea that the federal government is going to set aside land, not just that like, Native American people can be on, but that they have to be on if they want to be part of a tribe, right? If they're not going to assimilate and leave the tribe and just go move to, Pittsburgh and work for Andrew Carnegie or whatnot. So these reservations are going to be tribal land, right? Sure, tribally owned land, but they're not very good land, and they're not land where you actually live and where your ancestral lands are, and they are sort of at the whim of the United States government. So a big goal of the U.S. Army during this phase of the Indian Wars is essentially to force Native Americans onto reservations. One of the ways that they do that is by attacking their resources. So in particular by deliberately staging like killing campaigns for the buffalo, the bison, right, that roam the Great Plains, because without that resource, it's going to be very difficult for Native American tribes to survive off the reservations. They will attack like villages. With the Navajo, they like burn down villages and like spoil the water supply in a couple of places. So in addition to battles like the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Army is also engaged in, again, a sort of devastation of resources. By the latter part of the Indian Wars, once most tribes have been forced onto reservations, we're going to see kind of another shift in American government policy. There are several reformers, including Helen Hunt Jackson, whose book you can see on the slide here, who start to try to bring some attention to the really like sort of brutal regime that the United States has been imposing on Native Americans for the last 100 years. That's where the title Century of Dishonor comes from. You can think of Century of Dishonor as a muckraking book. We're going to get into the term muckraking a little bit more later on in this particular set of slides, but sort of trying to draw attention to an issue, and the issue being the government's mistreatment of Native Americans. But the solution that Helen Hunt Jackson and then the United States government adopt is not like that great either, because the solution is basically assimilation. Well, what we need policies that sort of treat Native Americans just like they are, homesteaders, right? Westward farmers. And then, in a few generations, they'll sort of have assimilated and like society can just kind of move on. So by the late 1800s, the policies of, like destruction and killing bison and stuff like that have shifted more to focus on, well, what can we do to kind of like break down tribal bonds and kind of quash Indian culture and Indian sovereignty, basically, and instead, again, just sort of make them into like, quote unquote, normal little Americans. A couple of examples of that, this is when the Indian boarding schools like Carlisle are founded, where they sort of take young children from their parents and they send them far away to boarding school and give them like an English name and cut their hair and sort of try to assimilate them, kind of forcibly into American culture. Another really good example of assimilation policy from this time period is a law that's passed. It's the Dawes Severalty Act, or just the Dawes Act is fine. And what this tries to do is it tries to take reservation land, which is bad land, but it's at least collectively owned by the tribe in the way that most tribes traditionally operate, and instead divide that up into like little 160-acre farms, like little homesteads, right, to give to each individual Indian family. Most tribes resist this vehemently. This is not like the way that they live or the way that they organize their societies. So there's sort of a long, slow like rollout of the Dawes Severalty Act. It doesn't go very well, but what it does do is it frees up a lot of land that can then be given to homesteaders. So again, the boarding schools, the Dawes Severalty Act, this is the like It's hard to say this or to pinpoint this, but I think that this is like the worst or one of the worst sort of periods of American government policy towards Native Americans is the sort of like 50 years here in the 1870s until the Dawes Act is eventually repealed during the New Deal in 1934, I think it is. It's right at the beginning of the New Deal. So the Indian Wars, again, another big impact or effect of westward settlement. Lastly, on the westward thing, before we kind of move on to another topic, one of the only actual historians who ever shows up on the exam as like content himself, not as like a stimulus, is this guy here on the slide. His name is Frederick Jackson Turner. He's an early historian of American like history in this time period that we're talking about. And in 1893, he presented like a speech and then a paper at I think one of the World's Fairs, if I'm not mistaken. That's usually just called his frontier thesis. The sort of longer title was the significance of the frontier in American society. And what Turner argues in the frontier thesis is basically that the sort of defining like element of what makes an American American, like what makes us sort of us as opposed to being just, like British or something, some other culture, is that we have always had a frontier, right? For our entire existence, there's always been sort of a westward area to kind of send our, rowdy young boys off, and then they kind of come back men, right, having tested themselves against the wilderness. And so what Turner is arguing in 1893 is that that's kind of done now, right? The 1890 census report declared that the frontier was closed, right? That term closed, there's no more sort of like wild areas for settlement. And so Turner was sort of positing like, how would this change the American culture? It is, again, a thesis that's very rooted in the time period that it comes from and in the sort of manifest destiny white supremacist ideals of the time period. But it is a theory that sort of centers the importance of like the frontier and frontier expansion in American history and American character. So that's the West. Next kind of topic from historical period 6 is what is going on in the South. A lot of this is stuff that I actually touched on at the very end of the historical period 5 video, because most of it is kind of like the legacy of Reconstruction. Like, okay, Reconstruction ends in 1877, kind of like, and then what? You can see some of the bolded terms on here that we have already talked about in the previous video, like sharecropping. So if you need a review of that, I would definitely suggest going back to the historical period 5 video. And then the other thing also mentioned is that the fact that starting in the 1870s, continuing in the 1880s, and then culminating in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court is undermining the 14th and 15th Amendments with a series of court cases that enshrine Jim Crow. So here's kind of like the New South in a nutshell. The New South was a term that was popularized by journalists from the South. Henry Grady is a journalist from, I think, Atlanta, if I'm not mistaken. And what Grady talked about and what the vision of a lot of like white Southerners in this time period was that they would build sort of a New South that had a lot of the sort of prosperity aspects of the North that was like a little bit more industrial, that used Southern labor and Southern cotton and Southern timber and things like that to bring industry factories right down to the South, but would still feel like the South socially in the sense that it would still have this sort of like old racial hierarchy of the South. So you would still have, kind of like a black laboring force that's locked in. So the New South is basically like how a lot of like white Southern progressives talked about sort of what was their vision for like what's the South going to become. What's the extent to which that happens? Well, we do see some industry moving to the South in, Durham, North Carolina and Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We get tobacco manufacturing plants, lots of furniture building, textile manufacturing moves into the South in this time period too. Not in huge numbers, but in significant numbers, notable numbers. But a lot of those are owned by people who are Northerners. Like they're not necessarily, it's not like Southern money necessarily. So it's quite compromised. And like agriculture, sharecropped agriculture, continues to be sort of the dominant economic sector in the South, right? That's where most of the money and the profit is coming from. So is there really a New South? It's kind of a vision or it's a proposal, but it's definitely, I would say, compromised at the very least. At the same time, of course, we do have the rise of Jim Crow. Jim Crow is the term for laws that segregate based on race, typically referring to black-white segregation, and we see other versions of that in other parts of the country. Jim Crow laws start as soon as Reconstruction ends, and they're sort of being built in this time period. Different states are kind of testing out different models, kind of seeing what they can get away with, right? The Supreme Court is very permissive, as I mentioned, and they're not really slapping down much. And then finally, Plessy versus Ferguson, does what we call codifying Jim Crow, which means that it sort of sets down, like in law, that separate but equal rules, right? Rules that segregate based on race are constitutional, and sort of officially kind of like ushers in the Jim Crow era. So that's sort of what's going on in the South in this whole time period that we're talking about from, again, 1865 through the 1890s. Next topic, really big one for this particular time period, is basically what we kind of broadly call the Gilded Age, or the sort of second half of the Industrial Revolution. As I mentioned way back in one of the earlier historical period videos, the College Board tends to divide up the Industrial Revolution into kind of two eras, pre and post-Civil War. The pre-Civil War era is usually called the Market Revolution, and the post-Civil War era, the one that we're in right here, is most frequently discussed as the rise of industrial capitalism. So that's a good phrase that you'll be seeing a couple times over the next few key concepts. This first key concept here is looking at sort of technological advances, sort of why is the United States able to industrialize so rapidly and successfully in this time period. Few examples. This is a time period where we're in another sort of like invention or innovation boom. Sorry, trying to get myself out of the way here. So a couple of good examples. Again, this is one of those things where you want to have just like a couple of inventions from the Gilded Age that you could talk about. There's sort of familiar, communications things like the telephone. This is the Thomas Edison era. So Thomas Edison's patenting of the light bulb, the kinetoscope, which was his name for the first movie camera, the first motion picture camera. Some other that are really like foundational or important for industry in this time period. The Bessemer process, which is a process for mass producing steel, right? Turning iron into steel in large batches relatively cheaply. That's a very big deal, especially if you're Andrew Carnegie. And then down at the bottom, refrigerated train cars that are patented by the Chicago meat packers, Gustavus Swift, I think in particular in this case, are going to really enable sort of the mass production of like food, basically, or sort of perishables in the United States to a degree that we haven't seen before. So there's many others that you might potentially have from your notes or from your reading, but this is a good just sort of like short set example of some of the types of inventions and innovations that we're seeing in the Gilded Age. Other reasons why we industrialize so rapidly, this is a great one to kind of pause on. The United States has a wide variety of natural resources. We have all sorts of minerals. We have manganese, we have iron, we have coal, we have oil, right, which we've discovered, in quite large quantities down in like the sort of Texas area in particular. We have a lot of lumber and timber, right? We have, just all of the kind of ores and natural resources that you can see on here, so we don't have to import quite as much. We have a sort of big, vast country that provides a lot of natural resources. And also, continuing on the causes, as I think I mentioned briefly at the beginning of the notes, the Civil War provides like a sort of boost of investment, right? Lots of people in the North, the Union during the Civil War, will make quite a bit of money off of the war and in the aftermath. Most of the sort of first real like billionaires in the United States make their money on railroads in particular, either during the Civil War or sort of shortly thereafter. Other reasons why we see kind of big growth, I've already mentioned that the Republican Party is very pro-business. They were subsidizing the Transcontinental Railroad. They're also pro-tariff, protective tariffs to help American businesses be more competitive inside the country against, competitor European businesses. So those are all, kind of part of the big stew of reasons why the United States is able to industrialize so rapidly. Impacts of this, like what do we get out of all of this new technology and resources and stuff like that? Well, we get the rise of industrial capitalism, aka big business is another term for that. This is a term for like not just like, oh, okay, we're making new things, but we have like new business and new financial structures. We have corporations, right, that we're developing for the first time, trusts, monopolies. They're not just operating in one city, they're operating all across the country, right, in these big conglomerates. They have shareholders, right, they look more like modern businesses than anything that we've seen before. We have become the world's biggest manufacturing power by 1870, and we have sort of like positive and negative impacts on kind of like people broadly. We're going to increase the standard of living. Stuff becomes a lot more cheap and available. My favorite example of this, of course, is soap. When soap gets mass produced, right, it becomes much cheaper and more easily available. But we also see a big increase in the wealth gap, right? What capitalism does is it allows the rich to get richer, right? If you have a lot of money or some money anyway already, and you invest that either wisely or luckily, then you can make a lot more money. But if you don't have money or you don't get lucky or you're not wise, then you wind up either stagnating or in many cases sort of going down the socioeconomic ladder. So socioeconomic impacts of industrial capitalism is largely what we're seeing on here. This is 6.6, and if you look at it, it's asking you to explain the socioeconomic continuities and changes, so things that stayed the same and things that changed associated with the growth of industrial capitalism. And this particular key concept focuses on what's going on with capital, meaning what's going on with like the businesses and businessmen, right? From the business perspective, sort of how are things going. The next key concept that we'll see in a couple slides looks at this same topic, but from the labor perspective, so the people who are like doing the work, right? So some examples, again, industrial capitalism is a term that we sort of just finished defining. Here's some other kind of examples of new business structures in this time period. Monopolies are probably the most well-known. But people in the time tended to use the term trusts for what we might call a monopoly today, a group of companies that are sort of banded together. Also pools, which are is something that's really associated with the railroad industry, holding corporations, etc. You need to know a couple of the Gilded Age businessmen, these industrial capitalists. You can just pick like 2 or 3. Usually people remember Carnegie and Rockefeller, so if you really want to like differentiate yourself, go ahead and learn a lot about Gustavus Swift or something like that. But usually what you need to know for these men is like their last name. So if you want to go Vanderbilt, you don't have to learn how to spell Cornelius. You need to go with the last name, and then sort of what is the industry that they dominate. And if you want like a little extra, it's nice to know if they're associated with like a specific city sometimes. So we have Rockefeller, who dominates the oil industry with his company Standard Oil based out of Cleveland. Carnegie, who dominates the steel industry with his like Carnegie Steel that eventually becomes U.S. Steel based out of Pittsburgh. JP Morgan is the head of a banking and finance empire that's going to make him the richest man in the world, and he will eventually loan the United States government enough money to keep functioning during a recession in the early 1900s. Gustavus Swift is meatpacking out of Chicago. Meatpacking is like animals go in, meat comes out, right? It's so processing live animals into meat. We have some media moguls like William Randolph Hearst, who ran a newspaper in New York. I already mentioned James B. Duke, tobacco down in Durham, and Vanderbilt, who I forgot to mention, starts out in steamboats during the Civil War and then jumps to railroads at just the right time, and he's one of like the first billionaires in the United States. So you don't need to know all of them, but I would pick like 1 or 2 to kind of have in your back pocket that you could talk about if you got like an SAQ or whatnot on this. The kind of colloquial term that's often applied to these big businessmen is quote unquote robber barons. And it's good, I think, to know that that is generally a term with negative connotations. It's a critique, right? So we're sort of inherently. The more positive term might be something like captains of industry or just industrial capitalist. This is a big, like, political cartoon time period. We have a lot of magazines, print culture is going wild. They're very high quality prints, and so the College Board will frequently use them. It is quite common to see a political cartoon from sort of this era, the late 1800s, early 1900s, on the exam. And so it's good to kind of be familiar with some of like the features of political cartoons from this time period. If you're looking at a cartoon that's trying to critique robber barons, it will probably have them dressed as walking money bags. So those sort of big bulging bellies with the kind of frilly ruff, like they're, again, a walking bag of money. You want to always pay attention to how things are labeled. That will give you a hint as to what the cartoonist is sort of trying to say, what the message of the cartoon is. But in general, if you're looking at a cartoon and it features sort of like a big fat dude, your goal is to try to figure out, is this like approving of this businessman? Is this like, oh, he's a good guy who like does a lot of philanthropy? Or is it a critique? And it's like, well, he's sort of crushing the working classes, or he's a hypocrite or whatnot. So again, these are very, very common types of cartoons to show up on the test. Here's the next key concept. This is the one that I was just mentioning. Same exact phrasing as the previous one, socioeconomic continuities and changes, but with a more of a labor focus, so focused on sort of like what's going on with workers in this time period. In particular, this is where labor unions tend to come up. So industrial capital means a rise in industrial work, and industrial work basically gets worse the later that it goes in the 1800s. If you worked in like the Lowell mills in the 1810s, probably wasn't that bad, regimented and different than other work that you have done, but not like exploitive. I don't think quite in the way that it's going to become. But by the time that you hit the 1870s, you are getting paid very little. There are no worker protections. There's no laws protecting you. You have very dangerous conditions. And when I say you're getting paid very little, you're getting paid like below the poverty line for like full-time, 7-day-a-week work. Working conditions inside the factories are unsanitary and dangerous. If you get your finger chopped off, they're just kind of like, oh well, don't bleed on the machine, please, get out, you're fired. Quite dangerous. Like conditions in terms of like air quality. Lots of people got trapped in buildings that caught on fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is the most significant example of that. And so what the response of workers is to all of these problems that again are accumulating and getting worse the later that you go in the 1800s is that some of them, not all of them, some of them are going to form labor unions. You need to know what a labor union is. A labor union is an organization of workers that is formed to bargain collectively with management. So they're sort of an organization of workers, and the goal is to sort of get better conditions or better pay from the sort of management of whatever, company or industry they are working for. Labor unions come in a bunch of different like flavors in this time period. Some of them are attempting to unionize like all workers, like we're all workers, we all have things in common, we should be sort of unified together. The one at the top here, Knights of Labor, which is the first big national labor union, is a union of all workers like this. Those can be hard to keep together. It's hard to maintain class consciousness here. And the Knights of Labor in particular is sort of brought down by accusations of violence around what's called the Haymarket Square riot. If you remember us talking about that, that's the one where someone throws a bomb into a crowd of striking workers who are at like a rally, basically, and the bomb kills several policemen. A bunch of people go to jail, several people are hanged, and the Knights of Labor is kind of like seen as like, oh, it's bad, or it's associated with the violence that happened there. By far the most successful, longest lasting labor union that comes out of this time period, and if you have to pick one and only one union to remember, I would make it number 2 on here. That is the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, and you can always just call it the AFL. Its initials are just fine here. It's founded by headed by Samuel Gompers for about the first 30 years of its existence, so this whole time period that we were talking about, and the AFL is much less like socialist, basically, much less radical than unions like the Knights of Labor. It's much more focused on organizing skilled workers, which is why it's usually called a skilled union, or a craft union is another term for that sometimes. The AFL is the first union to really figure out that, like, if we organize skilled workers, then our threats of strikes, right, sort of work stoppage, are more effective. They have sort of more leverage. So the AFL is more like elitist, basically, than some of the other unions, and it's also going to be longer lasting. I could say it's more effective, but really none of the unions in the Gilded Age are effective in the sense of like, and then things changed for the workers. Like, they all make some incremental changes for like some people in some industries, and then like those changes get rolled back. We are not going to see real significant change in the conditions of industrial workers until labor unions get protections under the New Deal. So in 1935, FDR will pass something called the Wagner Act, or the NLRA, that provides federal protections for workers who join unions, and then unions get powerful and become like actual agents of change. In this time period, unions are fighting hard for things like the 8-hour day, better pay, better conditions, right, those types of things, but most of them are not really happening yet, right? We're going to get there, but it takes like sort of decades of struggle. The other union on here that I want to highlight is the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World. They call themselves the Wobblies. I don't know why. The IWW is like the Knights of Labor in that it was like a union of all workers. And the IWW is very openly socialist. Like in their documents, they're like, hello, we are a socialist labor union. And so they are a great, like, you can sort of track like how is socialism doing in the United States by how is the IWW, how popular is the IWW. So when they started in the 1890s, pretty popular. Hit their peak in the 1910s. It was quite a large and fairly powerful labor union then. Like the American Socialist Party, they come out against World War I, and then we see a pretty big decline there afterwards. Big picture things to know about labor unions. The American public sees labor unions as violent and radical. Is that true? They're definitely portrayed as violent and radical in the American media. There are certainly some radical people leading labor unions, some socialists in particular, and people with other kind of like leftist political alignments. Most of the violence, though, is more done to the unions than done by them. So I think that's a particularly fair characterization, but is an effective one. At the sort of end of the Gilded Age, like in the 1890s, if you look at like what percentage of all American workers are unionized, it's like under 7%. So many workers form unions in this time period, but not all workers, because again, they were often seen as radical or violent. Here's a kind of another view of that. I was sort of skimming past terms like strikes, picketing, right, kind of tactics that labor unions might use. I yoinked this from APUSH Minutes. You might recognize the font there, so shout out to them. And so this is a good place to pause and take a look for some specific terms. Everything that's on here is defined, so this is like a good kind of pause and take a look over. And I was mentioning like when does this change? Like when do unions actually get some power? And that's the Wagner Act right down there, 1935. So still several decades in the future at this point. So that is like labor unions and kind of what's going on with workers in response to industrial capitalism. So far in response to industrial capitalism, we have farmers and organizations like the Grange and Populist Party, and then workers and their labor unions. This next set of key concepts is kind of like a grab bag. There is a lot going on here. I don't really love the way that the College Board organizes Historical Period 5, so if you look at this and you're like, it seems like some random stuff, Me too. But basically what we're talking about here are sort of changes in like society as a result of changes in the economy, and then also kind of more broadly just some reform movements in response to some of these changes. So I've already mentioned socialists a couple of times. Agrarians, that's just a term for farmer, like organizers, agricultural, right, agrarian, so farmer movements. And then also something that's called the social gospel. So we're going to take a sec here to compare three big ticket, big, like high value vocab terms for historical period 6 that it is very easy to get confused because they all sound really similar. So each of these three terms, social Darwinism, gospel of wealth, and social gospel, come from this period, the Gilded Age. Terms overlap, they're really easy to get confused, but they are kind of different things. So we're going to sort of take a sec here and make sure we define all of these. Social Darwinism is a viewpoint, a worldview, basically, that a lot of people adopt in this time period that's based on, well, sort of a misunderstanding, basically, of some of Darwin's ideas in his work on evolution, and that takes those ideas of things like survival of the fittest and then tries to apply them to individual human beings and also to like companies and businesses. And what social Darwinism says is basically that the world operates sort of naturally if you don't interfere with it, and that people who are sort of the best in some way, shape, or form, people with the best kind of like genes, we might say today, right, or the best kind of like characteristics or qualities, will naturally rise to the top of society, right, if given the chance to do so, and that therefore the people who are at the bottom of society, they're kind of down there because like they deserve it, right, that it's sort of like their fault. And it's really, if you believe in social Darwinism, it's kind of bad for the government to try to help people at the bottom of society because you're just interfering with like the natural flow of society. Lots of the wealthy robber baron businessmen of this time period love social Darwinism because it basically tells them that they're rich because they're awesome, right? They're like rich because like they're just like superior people, and who wouldn't want to hear that? So social Darwinism will remain a very popular, again, like sort of worldview all the way from this time period here, I think to and through the Great Depression, where we see it expressed by Herbert Hoover and his whole kind of like, rugged individualism, bootstraps type thing. So that's social Darwinism. In the middle, we have gospel of wealth. This is a phrase that's associated with Andrew Carnegie, and the image that you see there is a cartoon of Andrew Carnegie wearing an American flag kilt because he was a Scottish immigrant as a young child and then sort of sprinkling money about. And gospel of wealth was a pamphlet, an essay, basically, that Andrew Carnegie wrote. It was from Carnegie, directed to his fellow rich men, and what he said in it was, hey, fellow rich dudes, like, don't save up all of your money and, just buy fancy things and then pass it on to your, like, stupid children. Instead, what you should do with all of your money, since you're so smart and awesome having earned it, is you should give back to society like philanthropically in ways that you, the smart and superior person that you think that you are, sort of know best and can help people with. So Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth encouraged his sort of fellow robber barons to do things like, found colleges and fund libraries and fund, art museums and, gift, church organs to various like local churches and things like that. This is why so many of the robber barons have their names slapped all over stuff, right? So it's good. It's philanthropy, right? It's already charity, right? Giving back to society, but it's a very specific type of charity. It's a sort of social Darwinist type of charity because it doesn't involve paying your workers more or improving their conditions or giving them health care, right, or any of that type of stuff. It just involves like, what do you think would make society better? Well, I think it would be like a library with my name on it, right? So that's Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. Philanthropy, but like with like an asterisk, right? Third confusing term over at the far side, social gospel. This is a term for a movement inside of Protestant Christianity that kind of coincides with the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. If you remember all the way back when we talked about the Second Great Awakening, and I talked about how the Second Great Awakening leads to like social reforms, the social gospel is kind of a similar thing. It's sort of an interpretation that is common in Protestant churches in this time period that basically says if you want to really sort of like be a true Christian, what you should do is live that out by kind of working with the poor and the impoverished. The social gospel is going to lead people to become missionaries around the world, and here at home it's going to lead to the founding of like organizations like the Salvation Army and the YMCA that are doing sort of like work inside of like these poor communities themselves. So again, social Darwinism, worldview, gospel of wealth, philanthropy, social gospel, like Christianity in action. That's sort of what we've got going on with these three terms. And these three terms kind of like collectively or interchangeably apply to so many of the key concepts that we have left. So you'll see some of them recurring over the next few slides. Next topic for the Gilded Age. This is another big era of immigration. We have three big immigration waves in the United States. The first immigration wave we talked about back in the Historical Period 5 video. That was where we have people mostly coming from Ireland and Germany. The second wave, who are often referred to in this time period as the quote-unquote new immigrants, still people coming from Ireland and Germany. That doesn't stop, but we're going to see a big surge in people coming from Central Europe, so especially Italy in particular, and then also Eastern Europe, places like Poland and Russia, the Ukraine, right? Like all those sort of areas of Europe, we're going to see a big surge in for a variety of reasons. We also see a surge of immigration from I was going to say Asia, but really China specifically in this time period that dates back to the whole railroad construction boom, and that will be ended when the first Immigration Restriction Act, really in American history, is passed, called the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's passed in 1882, as you can see on the slide. Ellis and Angel Island are built in this time period to sort of process the big volume of immigrants that we have. Worth keeping in mind that it was really pretty easy to immigrate to the United States in this time period. I don't mean easy like whatever the journey was easy or anything like that. It was, it took weeks and there were a lot of hardships and it cost money. But once you got here, we didn't really have much of an immigration system. So you would just sort of present yourself and they would like write down your name and they'd give you like a medical inspection. And then if you had like a little bit of money and you had somewhere to go, like you had like an address or a name of someone that you were going to meet, then you could come in, right? We didn't have like quotas or restrictions or limitations. So it's a very open immigration period. And as a result, we're going to see a lot of immigration. This sort of second wave of immigration continues all the way through the 1920s. The law that's passed that ends this is it's called the National Origins Act, usually of 1924. And we'll talk more about that in the Historical Period 7 video. Responses to immigration. There are several on this slide. So the social gospel is one that we were just talking about, and so is social Darwinism. Both of those essentially are sort of positing that immigrants are kind of like a unique, like ethnic or demographic group inside of the United States that needs to be dealt with either through Christian charity or by just sort of like letting them fail, which would be the social Darwinism thing. But we also do see some very early like social reform movements that are aimed at the immigrant population in inner cities in particular. Most famous is the lady in the middle of the slide. Her name is Jane Addams, and she founds a settlement house called Hull House, Hull, Hull House in Chicago in the 1880s. Usually when you talk about Jane Addams, you talk about her with the Progressive Era, which is in the next historical period, but her activism does start in the 1880s, so it is sort of fit in this time period wise, and it's a great example of sort of like the early beginnings of what's going to become eventually the progressive movement. The other big response, of course, to immigrants in this time period is nativism or xenophobia, right? If you prefer, they're basically synonyms for our purposes anyway. Nativism is anti-immigrant backlash, which we see with every single wave of immigration that's ever come to the United States ever. And it tends to center on this idea that immigrants are undesirable, that they will never assimilate, they're sort of too different from us, they're having too many children, they're going to overrun us, they're taking all of our jobs, right? Those are sort of very common tropes in anti-immigrant rhetoric. And we see them aimed in this time period in particular at Jewish immigrants, especially Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants coming from like Russia and sort of the Russian Empire environs. And then also at Italian immigrants get quite a lot of flack in this time period as well, as they're seen as being sort of like not really like quite fully white, right, in some specific ways. And so there's a lot of debate in the Gilded Age about this question of like, what do we do about immigration? And are these immigrants going to assimilate? And is the United States a great melting pot? So this is another thing that you might potentially see a political cartoon about, because it was a source of a lot of political cartooning and debate in this time period. Next key concept set has to do with Gilded Age politics. And this is sort of our last topic for the unit, but it's like a little bit of a long one, so we'll be here for a few minutes. So Gilded Age politics is something that you have probably forgotten about, because it is something that we tend to cover relatively quickly, but it does, as you can see, make kind of an appearance in the key concepts here. There's sort of two things that you need to know politically. One is sort of like what's staying the same and then what's changing about politics in this time period. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about a couple of examples there. And the other one is asking you to be able to compare and contrast, right, similarities and differences between the various political parties of the Gilded Age. I live in fear of the day that this key concept is the DBQ, because I think this one will be really rough for a lot of students. It's a very sort of like niche or specific topic, but not for you, because you're here watching this video and you're going to learn a little bit about this in the next couple slides. So first up, reminder that the Gilded Age is kind of the era of like no-name presidents, right? All of these guys on the slide, you don't really need to know any of their names because none of them were very significant at the sort of national level, with the exception probably of Ulysses S. Grant at the beginning and then William McKinley down there at the end, who both have some level of significance outside of just being part of the Gilded Age. The fact that these are all kind of no-name presidents is not like an accident or a coincidence. It's because this is an era when the political parties did not tend to value someone who was like an independent leader who really wanted to kind of like use the presidency to change things, the way that we're going to see like Teddy Roosevelt in a few years or like Abraham Lincoln, right? Those kind of powerful like leader personalities. That's not really who the political parties are nominating in this time period. We are deep in the spoils system at this point, right? We are basically have developed a bureaucracy where people are paying for jobs inside of the federal government, and then that money is funding the political parties themselves. And so the chief job that a lot of the parties had for these guys, at the top of their presidential tickets, was to be kind of like the lead bureaucrat, right? To be sort of doling out federal jobs to people that the party wants to keep happy, who have, again, like supported the party monetarily or in some other way, shape, or form. So we don't really have any strong, like dominant presidents, right, in this sort of era of politics. What's Congress up to? Also not much. This is a not very productive period for Congress. The Senate in particular was known by people at the time period, the kind of like mean nickname for the Senate was the Millionaires Club, because this is before senators were elected. They were just appointed by the states, and state governors would just, again, tend to appoint whoever paid them the most. So what this did was it gave very rich people, the robber barons, quite a big degree of control over like the government and sort of what was or was not happening. This is a very famous political cartoon that has been on the AP exam in the past. It's called Bosses of the Senate, and you can see the little tiny senators sort of sitting at their desks and the big money bag monopolists kind of looming over them and controlling the Senate or controlling Congress in this time period. So if the president isn't powerful and Congress isn't powerful, who is powerful, right? Who is doing like the politicking? Well, part of it is the trust, right? The monopolists who are like buying various parts of the government. But we also see, especially at the state and local level, the sort of boom in power of these organizations called political machines. I'm going to try to get myself off of the definition here, called political machines. Political machine is a term for an organization, usually a political party, that runs all of the politics in a given, usually city, but sometimes at the state level as well, by organizing itself effectively enough to where they basically don't lose elections, right? They're sort of continually getting elected for years and years and years. Probably the most famous political machine in the country is the one that controlled New York City. It's called Tammany Hall as a Democratic Party political machine. And like New York City has Democratic mayors for it's like 150 years under Tammany Hall or something like that. So they sort of get in power and then they stay in power kind of consistently. And how they stay in power is this sort of hierarchical structure where every kind of politician has underneath them people who are underneath them and people who are underneath them, as you can kind of see on the slide in that diagram. It's actually very similar to the same structure that the mob uses, if you're familiar at all, but like less killing. Other ways that political machines maintain power, they provide services, which is, that's good. They are particularly good at maintaining sort of like the immigrant vote in the cities where they are the most powerful. They are the only ones providing any sort of services, building sewers, let's say, in slum neighborhoods or things like that. And then they also rely on just, good old-fashioned cheating, graft, right, using political power for personal gain, rigging elections. All of those things were common. This is sort of the era when, dead people voted and people would just, change their hats and come back and vote again. So not really a lot of regulation of politics, voting, right? None of those were very heavily regulated in the Gilded Age. It's a problem that the progressives will try to address. So that's sort of what's going on in politics, and again, sort of changes and continuities that we've seen since the last time that we talked about political era. Here is another clip of this same document, this sort of political parties flowchart that I've been excerpting in these videos, which again, you have a link to on the class canvas. This is a great place for that whole comparing and contrasting political parties thing. Basically, by this point, by the Gilded Age, what we have is we have the Republican and the Democratic parties, and that's what we have as of the Civil War, and it's what we still have today, right? So what we're looking at from here on out is sort of how do these two political parties shift? Who's their constituencies, who's voting for them, and then how do they grow and change? In the Gilded Age, both the Republicans and the Democrats are pretty pro-business. The Republicans have always been pro-business, pro-tariff, pro-railroads, pro-subsidies, and the Democrats increasingly become more pro-business as part of that whole kind of New South thing that we were talking about earlier. But the Democrats remain very based in the South. Their sort of power base is in like white Southern voters. And so they're going to combine the whole kind of like more pro-business thing with very strong pro-segregation and pro-Jim Crow, right, type policies or type attitudes. So that's kind of what's going on with the two main political parties. The Democrats are also going to pretty successfully position themselves as like a reform party because the Republicans are in charge for so long that the Democrats are able to be like, look at all of this corruption, like elect us and we will fix it. That's how Grover Cleveland gets elected. The other thing to know about the Gilded Age is that this is another era where we're going to see some third parties pop up. Usually we see a lot of third parties in eras where there are big reform movements going on, so this is sort of a hint that we're heading towards the progressive era. You can see them on the slide here. Up at the top in green is a party called the Greenback Party, which supported currency reform and wanted the government to bring back paper money that it had printed and then during the Civil War and then stopped printing when the war ended. Down at the bottom you see the Prohibition Party. I bet you can guess what that is. It's a single issue reform party that sort of was supporting prohibition. And then most important and most significant of the third parties in sort of light blue up at the top there near the Democrats is the Populist Party. So we're just sort of swinging back to the Populist Party that we started with all the way back at the beginning of the notes. Again, the Populist Party comes out of the farmer reform movements and an attempt to combine that with like urban reformers, right, sort of workers across all sectors. The Populist Party is significant because it is really the first successful political party at the sort of federal or national level that's platform is basically pushing the government to do more. Like the government should be doing more for people. Increasingly, that's going to be a platform plank that we'll see other parties adopt as we get more into the 20th century, but the Populist Party is kind of the first to do so. And what they want the government to do, they want the government to regulate railroads and utilities. They want the government to subsidize what were called treasuries for grain so that farmers could sort of store their grain and then sell it when prices were advantageous. They wanted the government to coin more silver, meaning to make more money based on silver, which would increase our money supply. If that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, it doesn't really need to. All that you need to understand is that farmers thought that that would help them get out of debt. If they increased the money supply, it would be easier to pay off their debts. Again, you don't actually need to understand the economic underpinnings. The Populist Party also introduced reforms that are going to later become the 16th and 17th Amendments. They call for graduated income tax so that rich people are paying income tax, right? And they also call for direct election of senators so that the Senate's not the millionaires club. The most popular of these positions are eventually going to be absorbed into the Democratic Party after the Populist Party kind of crashes and burns in the 1896 election with William Jennings Bryan. You can see kind of down there at the bottom. But again, the Populist Party's significance, it's sort of a precursor to the progressive era and the sort of progressive politics that we're going to talk about in the next video. And it is also the first of a series of parties and a series of kind of like political reforms that are going to be pushing the American government to sort of do more with its power. The height of the Populist Party's power comes in 1896. They decide not to run their own candidate. Instead, they decide to endorse William Jennings Bryan, who was the sort of young Democratic-like reformer candidate at the time period, after he gives a very powerful and fiery speech called the Cross of Gold speech, where he compares the gold standard to like the crucifixion, excuse me, of Jesus. Sorry, I got a little tripped up on that word there. And so in 1896, Bryan runs this like fairly radical for the time period kind of reformist campaign attacking like the Republican Party as being like these sort of stodgy, like big business guys. And he loses in the 1896 election, and that takes a lot of the air out of the Populist Party movement. The party kind of falls apart. We still see kind of like regional or state level populist parties continuing for some time, but this is the last time that they're going to have kind of like national influence. Okay, so last thing for this particular video. This is the Gilded Age, and then the next video will pick up with the progressive era. But in truth, historians kind of like disagree with when does the Gilded Age like stop and when does the progressive era start, or do they overlap, etc. That's sort of a point of active debate among, I think, historians in general. So I think it's useful just to take a look at some of the potential like kind of transition points where we could say that we're going away from the Gilded Age and into the more sort of reformy progressive era. These are all pretty good kind of specific pieces of information here. So possibly the earliest that you could say the Gilded Age is ending and the progressive era is starting is in the 1880s. A few things going on in the 1880s. We have some of the first like federal reform laws passed. The Pendleton Civil Service Act, which is the act that is passed after the assassination of the president with the intent of reforming the bureaucracy and trying to get rid of the spoils system. So that's a great example of like, it's really one of the first like political reform laws passed in 1883. I mentioned earlier the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC. That's the first federal regulatory agency. So that's also a point where you could be like, okay, look, this feels kind of progressive. And then in 1889, right at the end of the 1880s, as I mentioned earlier, is when Jane Addams founds Hull House, which is really the first, again, kind of like social or urban reform of the progressive era. So those are some kind of 1880s things that are at least foreshadowing progressivism. I would say the most classic date that a lot of people tend to start the progressive era is in 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act is the first law to attempt to regulate monopolies and trusts, to try to sort of break them up. Not super successful, at least not at first, but it is often used as kind of a starting date for the progressive era for that reason. The Panic of 1893, there are two major financial panics in the Gilded Age, one in 1873, one in 1893. And the 1893 one's really bad. This was like the Great Depression before the Great Depression. And so it did lead to a lot of essentially kind of like reform movement pushing. This is where we get basically like the Populist Party sort of gets its rise off of the fact that people are responding to the poor economic conditions in the Panic of 1893. The Populist Party election that I just talked about in 1896, that's another potential point. And then I think the like latest possible point, if you're trying to start the Gilded Age, or excuse me, start the progressive era as late as possible, would be when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. Teddy Roosevelt is a progressive, and so when he kind of accidentally becomes president after McKinley is assassinated in 1901, we're definitely in the progressive era at that point, because we have a progressive president. So sometime between the 1880s and 1901, the progressive era starts, and that is where we will pick up in the next video for Historical Period 7. Thank you all for your time. Bye.